Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into a case that's really got us scratching our heads.
Yeah, this one's a real doozy.
It is Kimberly Clark Saenz,
Oh, yeah.
a licensed practical nurse who was convicted of murdering patients.
At a dialysis center in Texas.
In Texas, yeah. And we've got a lot of material to go through for this one. Court records, news reports, even a License to Kill episode.
Oh, wow, they did an episode on this one.
They did. So we're really trying to get to the bottom of how this seemingly ordinary life, I mean, on the surface, everything seems, pretty normal. It took such a dark turn.
Right, right. And I think that's really the core of what we're doing today, right? It's not just like, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened. It's like, why? Like, how?
Exactly. It's like assembling a puzzle.
It is. It really is.
With each piece of information kind of giving us a clearer picture.
Yeah, and I think, especially with this case, it's so complex. There are so many layers to it, and it's disturbing.
It is disturbing. So let's start with Kimberly Clark Saenz herself.
Okay.
Born in Massachusetts, raised in Texas.
Cheerleader.
Cheerleader,
Young mom.
Young mom, not exactly what you'd expect.
Not the typical, profile you think of.
Yeah. But even early on, there were signs that something wasn't quite right.
Right.
Particularly her employment history in healthcare. She was fired from multiple jobs.
Including one where she stole Demerol.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that each firing seemed to involve, some kind of deception or violation of trust.
Right. It's like, how did she keep getting these jobs?
Right. Makes you wonder if there was this, pattern of behavior.
A pattern of behavior.
That maybe went unnoticed or was dismissed.
Right, exactly. And, it makes you think about, how thorough were these hiring practices?
Especially in healthcare, where lives are literally at stake.
Exactly, exactly. And this is where our dive gets even more unsettling.
Okay.
So fast forward to 2008, Saenz is working at a DaVita dialysis clinic in Lufkin, Texas. And, for a while, everything seems pretty normal. But then in April, the clinic is hit with this sudden and unexplained spike in patient emergencies.
During dialysis treatments.
And
that really stood out to me in the research.
Yeah.
That dialysis patients, they rarely code, right?
Yeah, it's extremely rare.
So to have this surge in emergencies, what? Why? That's a major red flag.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, dialysis is a routine procedure for people with kidney failure. So while there are always risks, like with any procedure, cardiac arrest during dialysis is super rare.
So when the Lufkin Clinic started seeing multiple patients coding...
Yeah, it's like something's really wrong here.
Something's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it wasn't just a few isolated incidents either.
No.
It was 30 EMS calls that April.
Oh, wow.
Double the usual number.
That's a huge increase.
Yeah, it's wild.
It is.
And that's what triggered the initial investigation.
It was DaVita, the company that runs the clinic, sent their clinical coordinator, Amy Clinton.
To investigate. Okay. But here's where it gets even more perplexing, right? The emergencies didn't stop even with Clinton on site.
Right.
So it wasn't just like a string of bad luck or a temporary equipment malfunction.
Exactly. Something else was going on.
Something else was going on. And thankfully, the paramedics treating these patients were astute enough to recognize that.
Right.
They contacted their superiors.
And a secret report was filed.
With state health inspectors.
Yeah. And that was really a turning point.
Okay.
Because it shifted the focus from an internal review to oh, this could be criminal.
Okay. It's amazing how it's sometimes those on the front lines, like the paramedics in this case, who first sense that something is truly wrong.
Absolutely. They're seeing it firsthand.
Yeah. So what happened next? Did the state inspectors find anything suspicious?
They did. And it's a pretty chilling discovery.
Okay.
So April 28, 2008, inspectors are on site. They're observing. And two more patients, Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton.
Oh, no.
Suddenly go into distress, severe drops in blood pressure.
Talk about bad timing.
I know, right? You've got the inspectors right there.
Oh, man.
And these two patients, they witness signs injecting something into the dialysis lines of the patients in distress.
And they knew it wasn't saline solution.
They knew it wasn't saline.
Oh, no. What was it?
What they saw signs injecting was bleach.
Bleach? I mean, come on. It's just hard to believe that someone would intentionally do that.
It's horrifying.
Inject bleach into a patient's dialysis line. It's like something out of a horror movie.
It really is.
Yeah. So did they confront her?
They did.
What did she say?
Saenz claimed she was, just cleaning a dialysis machine.
With bleach?
With bleach, and she said she used a syringe, for precise measurement.
That sounds fishy.
Right. And remember, we talked about her history of not following procedures.
Uh-huh.
Well, this contradicted DaVita policy.
Okay.
They strictly prohibited using bleach in that manner. And the physical evidence backs up the eyewitnesses. The bucket Saenz was using, the syringes, tested positive for bleach.
Okay, so at this point, the police are called in.
Yes,
The clinic is shut down for 2 months.
2 months. Can you imagine?
What a nightmare for everyone involved, especially the patients who relied on that clinic for their care. It must have been terrifying for them.
Oh, absolutely. Wondering if they were going to be the next victim.
Right, right. So, like we talked about before, it's like assembling a puzzle.
Yeah.
And a CDC epidemiologist who was brought in to investigate, they uncovered this chilling pattern. Saenz was present at every single incident in April where a patient died at the clinic.
Every single one.
That's crazy.
I know. It is pretty powerful circumstantial evidence, right?
Wow. So not just present at the clinic, but present at every incident where a patient died. Huge red flag.
Huge red flag.
And then the investigation turned up something even more incriminating, right?
They did. This is where technology comes in.
Okay.
Investigators searched Saenz's computer.
And
They found Google searches.
for
Information about the lethality of bleach.
Wow, I mean, that's pretty damning evidence. Makes you wonder what else she might have been searching.
Right.
Did they ever figure out why she was researching bleach in the first place?
You know, that's the million-dollar question. And sadly, it's one we may never have a definitive answer to.
So she's clearly on their radar at this point,
Oh, yeah.
and they're starting to build a case against her. So what happened next? Did they bring her in for questioning?
They did.
Okay.
And during questioning, Saenz's story starts to unravel. She mentions using bleach to clean lines before the detectives even bring it up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she claims she used a syringe to measure the bleach because measuring cups weren't available.
Uh-huh. Those inconsistencies in her statements definitely don't help her case.
No, not at all. It sounds like they had enough to arrest her at this point, right?
Yeah, it does. Eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, the computer searches, and then her own contradictory statements. Like all the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place.
Right.
So they arrest her.
On 5 counts of capital murder
Wow.
and 5 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
5 counts of capital murder. That's a heavy charge. Can you clarify what aggravated assault with a deadly weapon means? Like, I know it sounds serious, but
Yeah, of course.
what makes it aggravated?
So basically it means that the assault was committed with an intent to cause serious bodily injury,
Okay.
and that a deadly weapon was used. In this case, the bleach would be considered the deadly weapon.
Okay, so not just assault, but with the intention to cause serious harm.
Right.
Using a dangerous weapon.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And, you know, using bleach as a weapon, it just adds this whole other layer of complexity to the case.
Right.
It's not your typical murder weapon, so proving Saenz's guilt was even more challenging.
Right, because it's not like a gunshot or a stabbing where the cause of death is more obvious.
Exactly. So how do you prove that bleach was what killed the patients?
Yeah, this is where forensic science comes in, right?
Absolutely. And this is where the expertise of Mark Sataski becomes really crucial.
Okay, who's that?
He was an analytical chemist and a bioterrorism expert.
Okay.
And he was developing a test
Two.
to detect bleach in the bloodstream.
Hold on, there's a test to detect bleach in the bloodstream.
There is.
That sounds like something out of a crime drama.
I know, right?
How does that even work?
So when bleach is injected into the bloodstream, it triggers this process called hemolysis.
Okay.
Basically, the red blood cells explode,
Oh, wow.
releasing iron. And this leads to cardiac arrest
And death.
and death. So Sachaski's test, which he was actually developing for like bioterrorism scenarios,
Oh, wow.
detects a specific byproduct of bleach exposure
Okay.
called chlorotyrosine
Chlorotyrosine.
in the blood.
So this test he was developing for bioterrorism ends up being the key to unlocking this murder case.
It does. It's pretty amazing, right?
That's incredible.
It makes you realize how scientific advancements, you know, even those intended for one purpose, can have these unexpected applications in completely different fields.
Totally. So he tested samples from Saenz's victims?
He did. And
And-
the results were shocking. The chlorotyrosine levels off the charts
Wow. So that confirms that bleach had entered their bloodstreams.
and contributed to their deaths.
And this was the missing link the prosecution needed, right?
Yes, they could finally directly connect Saenz to the murders.
Wow, that's a game changer. So they've got the eyewitnesses, they've got the online searches, they've got the inconsistent statements, and now they have scientific proof that bleach was the murder weapon.
Right.
Sounds like they have an airtight case.
It does seem that way.
But there's still one major piece of the puzzle missing, right?
What's that?
The motive.
The motive. The why.
Why would she do this? I mean, we know from coworker testimony that Saenz expressed like dislike for some of the patients who died.
Right.
But hold on, let's pause there for a second.
Okay.
Before we dive into that coworker testimony, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on the Kimberly Clark Saenz case on the deep dive.
We were talking about Saenz's motive,
Right, the why.
or the lack of one.
Yeah.
and how some of the coworker testimony revealed that she wasn't exactly fond of all her patients.
So what did her coworkers have to say about her interactions with them?
Well, one coworker, Candace Lackey,
Okay.
she testified that Saenz had openly expressed dislike for a number of patients,
Really?
many of whom either died or coded during that April.
It's chilling to think that
Mm.
she was potentially harboring like resentment towards these patients,
Right.
especially considering they were in her care.
Yeah.
But dislike alone doesn't really explain the premeditation
Right.
and like the calculated cruelty of injecting them with bleach.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a complex issue, and it's important to avoid, jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
There's a difference between disliking someone and wanting to actively harm them.
Did any other coworkers offer insights into Science's behavior?
Yes, there was another coworker, Sharon Dearman.
Okay.
She shared pretty disturbing anecdote.
Oh.
She recalled Saenz nonchalantly taking a cigarette break
Okay.
after tending to a patient named Opal Few.
Okay.
And Opal Few, shortly after she coded,
Oh no.
but Saenz refused to rush to her aid.
That's a really unsettling detail.
It is.
It paints this picture of someone who's either like incredibly callous
Right.
or just completely detached from the seriousness of the situation.
Yeah, it certainly raises questions about her empathy and professionalism.
For sure.
But it's important to note that these anecdotes, while disturbing,
Yeah.
they don't offer, like, concrete evidence of motive.
So we have these glimpses
Right.
into her potential animosity towards some patients, but the why
The why?
behind her actions remains elusive.
It's the missing puzzle piece.
Yeah.
Right, that would let us see the full picture.
So let's just recap what we know so far.
Okay.
We have a seemingly ordinary woman with a troubled work history,
Uh-huh.
a sudden spike in patient deaths at the dialysis clinic where she works, eyewitness accounts of her injecting bleach into patient lines,
Right.
damning Google searches,
Right.
inconsistent statements to police, and scientific evidence confirming the presence of bleach in the victim's bloodstreams.
A lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It seems like the prosecution has a pretty strong case against her, wouldn't you say?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming.
But the legal process is complex.
It is.
And the prosecution still needed to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt
Right.
that Saenz was guilty of these crimes.
Right.
So what happened at the trial?
Well, the trial began in March 2012.
Okay.
And the defense argued that Saenz was not guilty
Oh, wow.
of the murders. They claimed that the bleach injections were not the cause of death,
Okay.
and that the prosecution's case was based on, circumstantial evidence
Mm-hmm.
and unreliable witnesses.
It sounds like a tough defense strategy,
It was.
considering the mountain of evidence against her.
Right.
Did they call any witnesses to support their claim?
They did,
And
but their attempts to discredit the prosecution's witnesses and the scientific evidence,
oh, right, with the chlorotyrosine test?
yeah, that was largely unsuccessful.
It's hard to imagine how you could argue against that level of, like, scientific proof.
Yeah, it does seem like they were grasping at straws.
And
The
ultimately,
jury didn't buy it.
right.
After deliberating, they delivered their verdict.
What was it?
Guilty. Saenz was convicted in March 2012 of murdering 5 patients and injuring 5 others.
Guilty on all counts.
All counts.
That's huge for the prosecution.
It is.
And more importantly, for the victims and their families.
Absolutely.
What was her sentence?
Well, the prosecution initially sought the death penalty,
Oh, wow.
but ultimately Saenz was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the 5 murders,
Okay.
plus 60 years for aggravated assault.
Life in prison without parole.
That means she'll spend the rest of her days behind bars,
Wow.
reflecting on the gravity of her crimes.
It must have been powerful for the families of the victims to finally see justice served.
I'm sure it was.
Did they have a chance to speak?
They did.
Okay.
During the victim impact statements, the families, they expressed their raw emotion,
Yeah.
their anger. They called Saenz a psychopathic serial killer
Wow.
and hoped that she would burn in hell.
It's heartbreaking to think about the ripple effect of these crimes.
I know.
It's not just the victims themselves, but their families, their friends.
Their community.
Yeah, the entire community suffers.
It's true.
So this case
Yeah.
really highlights the profound and lasting impact that healthcare professionals
Right.
can have on their patients.
It's a huge responsibility.
It is. It's a reminder that trust is paramount in the medical field.
Yeah.
And that violation of that trust,
It can have devastating consequences.
we've covered a lot.
We have.
We've explored the investigation, the evidence,
Uh-huh.
the trial, the sentencing,
Right.
but there's still so much more to unpack,
There is,
especially when it comes to the broader implications of this case.
for sure.
You mentioned earlier that there's this belief that there may be more victims out there. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the CBC epidemiologists who investigated the case,
Uh-huh.
they found statistical links between Saenz and other events at the clinic.
Other adverse health events.
Other adverse health events.
So are we talking about other potential bleach poisonings?
Potential.
Or something else entirely?
Well, the exact nature of these events, it wasn't specified in the materials we have.
Okay.
But the epidemiologist's findings suggest a pattern of harm.
Associated with her.
Associated with Saenz being there, yeah.
That's incredibly disturbing.
It is.
But if they suspected there might be more victims, why weren't more charges brought against her?
That's a good question.
Was there not enough evidence?
Well, unfortunately, investigators were only able to obtain medical waste from the 2 weeks leading up to April 28th, 2008,
Okay.
when she was finally caught.
Right.
And this limited the scope of their investigation, so the evidence wasn't strong enough to pursue additional charges.
It's frustrating to think that there might be other victims out there.
Right.
Whose cases were never fully investigated.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how many other healthcare workers might be slipping through the cracks,
Right.
potentially harming patients.
Without anyone noticing?
Without anyone noticing. It's a valid concern.
Definitely.
And it raises questions about the systems we have in place.
To protect patients.
To protect patients, yeah.
This case really highlights potential systemic issues.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how prevalent this problem might be in the healthcare industry?
Well, that's a really complex question, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
Cases like Saenz's are thankfully rare,
Right.
but they do expose vulnerabilities in the healthcare system.
Like what?
Well, one of the most glaring issues is the lack of a comprehensive system for tracking employee misconduct.
Across healthcare facilities?
Across facilities, yeah.
So if a nurse is fired for negligence or misconduct at one hospital,
Right.
there's no guarantee that this information will be shared with other potential employers.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. That's a major problem.
It is.
Saenz, for example, she had a history of being fired
Right.
from these healthcare jobs,
Uh-huh.
but she was still able to find employment.
At other facilities.
That's terrifying.
It is. It really is.
It suggests that there might be other healthcare workers out there
Right.
with similar histories of misconduct.
Who are still actively caring for patients.
That's scary. What can be done to address this?
Well, there are a number of things that could be done. Implementing more stringent hiring procedures,
Okay.
mandating thorough background checks,
Makes sense.
and creating a centralized database to track employee misconduct.
Okay, yeah, those sound like sensible and necessary measures
They do.
to prevent similar tragedies.
Absolutely.
But it also makes you wonder if there's a deeper issue at play here.
Right. Like, is it simply a matter of tightening up procedures?
Yeah.
Or is there something more fundamental that we need to be looking at?
We focus a lot on the details of the case
Uh-huh.
and the systemic issues.
Right.
But it's also important to try to understand what might have driven Saenz to do this in the first place.
Of course, the human element.
Right.
Why?
What are some of the theories?
Well, some experts have speculated that Saenz may have derived a sense of power
Okay.
or control from causing harm to these vulnerable patients.
Interesting.
They point to the fact that many of her victims were elderly or in poor health.
Right. So easy targets.
Easy targets for manipulation.
It's horrifying to think that someone would prey on the most vulnerable members of society
No.
for their own twisted sense of satisfaction.
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
Are there any other theories about her motivations?
Yes. Others have suggested that she may have been suffering from a mental health condition
Okay.
that contributed to her actions.
Mm-hmm.
Some have even speculated that she might have had a personality disorder like antisocial personality disorder,
Okay.
which is characterized by a lack of empathy and remorse.
But without a confession or like a more thorough psychological evaluation,
Right.
it's impossible to know for sure.
We can speculate,
Yeah.
but ultimately the true motives behind Saenz's actions may forever remain a mystery.
And that's part of what makes this case so unsettling.
Right.
It forces us to confront the dark side of human nature
Yeah.
and acknowledge that sometimes there are no easy answers.
Sometimes there just aren't.
It's a sobering reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places,
That's true.
and that the people we trust the most can be capable of unimaginable acts.
Right.
But it's important to remember that this case also highlights incredible human resilience and the importance of seeking justice for those who have been wronged.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive
Okay.
into the Kimberly Clark Saenz case, I'm left with a mix of emotions.
Yeah, I hear that.
Sadness for the victims and their families,
Uh-huh.
anger at the senselessness of it all,
Of course.
but also a renewed appreciation for vigilance, critical thinking, and a commitment to creating a safer healthcare system.
For everyone.
Yeah,
Well said.
it's a case that stays with you.
It does.
A case that prompts reflection
Right.
and raises questions.
That we as a society
Yeah.
need to grapple with.
But it's also a case that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter future.
Always.
I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
Yeah,
We've covered a lot of ground, explored the complexities of the
we
case,
did.
and examined the broader implications of this tragedy.
We did.
But for those of you listening who are intrigued by this case
Right.
and want to delve even deeper, I highly recommend checking out the License to Kill episode that covers Kimberly Clark Saenz.
I think that's a great idea.
It's a fascinating and disturbing look
It is.
into her crimes and the investigation that brought her to justice.
It's a great resource for those who want to explore it further.
So until our next deep dive,
Right.
keep those minds curious
Keep them curious.
and those questions coming.
Yeah, keep asking those questions.
And remember, sometimes the most unsettling stories
Uh-huh.
are the ones that teach us the most valuable lessons.
I think that's true.
You know, it's cases like this that remind us that there's a very human side to these stories
Right.
for the victims and those left trying to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. And while we can't change the past, maybe by understanding what factors contributed to, to Saenz's transformation, we can better identify and address those warning signs in others.
Yeah.
And maybe even prevent similar tragedies.
Right. And that's a really powerful thought.
It is.
It's not just about seeking justice, but
No.
learning from these crimes
Right.
to help shape a safer future.
Absolutely.
Speaking of learning, before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
was there anything in the source material that really stood out to you?
What struck me was the challenge the prosecution faced
Okay.
early on. Proving that bleach injected into dialysis lines actually reached the bloodstream. It wasn't straightforward.
Right.
It required a very specific type of forensic expertise.
And luckily,
Mark.
Sachaski was developing that at the time.
Right. Like, if this had happened a few years earlier, they might not have had the tools
They might not have.
to definitively link the bleach to the deaths.
It makes you realize how crucial forensic science is.
It is.
Not just in solving crimes, but in ensuring justice.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how important it is to invest in that kind of research and development.
Yeah.
Who knows what other breakthroughs might be possible with continued support and innovation in that field.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Kimberly Clark Saenz case,
Yeah.
I'm left with this one final lingering thought for everyone listening to ponder. Could there be more victims out there?
Right.
And if so,
Yeah.
what could have been done to prevent their deaths?
That's a tough question.
It's a chilling question.
It is.
But I think it really underscores the importance of not just punishing wrongdoing,
Uh-huh.
but taking those proactive steps
Right.
to prevent similar tragedies in the future.
I completely agree. I mean, this case, it's not just about one nurse and her victims,
Bigger than that.
It's about the trust we place in healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
And the systems that are in place to protect patients
Yeah.
from those who might betray that trust.
Exactly. We can't change the past,
Nope,
but we can learn from it
we can't.
and work towards a future where healthcare is synonymous with safety and compassion.
I like that.
Until our next deep dive.
Yes.
Keep those minds curious.
Keep them curious.
And those questions coming.
Always asking.